The Mustang, the P-51, longest range fighter in the world. Speed, fast climb, quick dive, tight turn. A fighter pilot's dream.
The P-51 Mustang is one of the most famous and successful fighter aircraft of all time. It was American-made for use by the British, but the United States quickly saw its potential and put it in their own squadrons as well. It saw service in the skies over Europe, in the Pacific, as well as in the Korean War. But its long-range fighter escort missions over Germany is where it earned its reputation.
What made the Mustang such a great aircraft was the wing. The laminar flow wing was the big development that let this aircraft have the range that it should. What it gave the aircraft was the ability to fly great ranges, and that's why this aircraft was an escort, such a great escort aircraft.
However, the Mustang was not immediately successful.
The engine in this aircraft is a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The original A model Mustangs had Allison engines in them. The difference between the Allison and the Merlin was the Merlin had a two-stage blower on it, which helped it fight at altitude, which is where the bombers lived.
There are almost 15,000 Mustangs produced, the most common being the D model, and many served in air forces around the world for decades, and to this day, they are still a very popular aircraft for air racing. It was such a popular aircraft that Ford actually named its car the Mustang after the fighter. This particular model is a P-51C and is operated by the CAF of Minnesota.
This is called a Razorback Mustang, and that's because the canopy framing comes right up behind your head and the metal skin continues back. The later models were bubble top canopies, where it's glass all the way from the back all the way over the top, so the visibility is better.
This is a far more rare aircraft to be found in flying condition than the more numerously produced D models.
There's several airplanes flying of the Razorback style, the A's, B's, and C's, but this was, I think, the second 2 or 3 that were actually going to be flying, actively flying throughout the world at the time.
The story behind this aircraft, though, is far more unique than just its type. This aircraft was built in Texas and then delivered to the Army Air Corps in 1944 with stops in Florida and Georgia. When the war ended, it was surplused and then sat for 25 years on a pole at Montana State University. When the university wanted to get rid of it, the wings were cut off and the CAF acquired it in 1970 and it was shipped to Texas. From there it went to Minnesota, back to Texas, then to Iowa, a stop in Omaha, then finally from Iowa back to Minnesota for restoration.
The only way I can explain the original project, it had been shipped around so many times and moved through so many hands and so many facilities. It was the only way I can equate it is to like a dead animal in the woods. Parts were strewn everywhere. And when we were trying to reassemble the airplane, part of my job was to acquire the parts or to track down the parts where they were. Some say it took 10 years. But the significant advancements, it takes a couple of years to put one of these together. Several different units had tried to restore it unsuccessfully due to lack of resources, because it's a significant amount of money and resources to put this back in the air. The name Tuskegee Airmen was to represent all fighter groups and the ground people that handle the airplanes, the ordnance people, and not to exclude anybody in the significance of the Tuskegee Airmen as a whole. Bringing the airplane out into an educational forum, it represented the total Tuskegee group in the effort of the Tuskegee Airmen.
The Tuskegee Airmen were a group of African-American pilots who flew in fighter and bomber groups during World War II and were the first African-American military aviators in the United States. They had to fight racism at home, a segregated military, as well as their country's enemies in the air. Despite these adversities, they trained and flew with distinction.
Yesterday, I fulfilled one of my ambitions as a combat pilot. I got one airplane, and the second ship was me, and 2 Focke-Wulfs came on my right. I turned right and put up a stone wall of bullets.
The Tuskegee Airmen first flew in P-40 Warhawks, then briefly with P-39 Air Cobras, later with P-47 Thunderbolts, and finally the fighter group acquired the aircraft with which they became most commonly associated, the P-51 Mustang. When the pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group painted the tails of their aircraft red, the nickname Red Tails was coined. Their success in defending the bombers they escorted led to their units being requested by those flight crews.
The idea being is to educate people of the adversities and the problems that the Tuskegee Airmen overcame, and to tell the story of the Tuskegee Airmen, with this being one of the tools of that educational program. Well, I had the honor of flying with the Mustang on the first rebuild. In the first flight, I was able to go with Don Heinz was in the back of Gunfighter, with Reg Ursula was flying that. Bob Odegaard was flying this Mustang, and we're doing photo shoots out of Don's T-34. And I think that was a real unique experience for me to be able to fly with the airplane on its first flight, maiden flight, on its original rebuild. That was a lot of fun.
Yes, he said original rebuild because the aircraft you see today has been rebuilt twice.
About 4 years into the flying, the airplane had a catastrophic engine failure, and basically the airplane came out of the air. Don Heinz was piloting the aircraft. He did not have the opportunity to land the airplane in an open area. He went between the houses, hit at an angle, and had a catastrophic failure at that point, which he passed away in that accident.
We were all at Red Wing when the aircraft went down with Don. And so for our group, we pretty much determined that at that time this aircraft was going to go back together.
We've lost 4 Mustangs, and 4 of those people are gone today. They're associated with the project. It was not as significant as a project it was the first time, but nonetheless, it was a monumental effort to pull the resources together to get the airplane back in the air.
A new filter was added during the second rebuild for the oil system with a finer screen and a chip detector.
Is when the engines start self-destructing, the parts start floating around in the oil system. You'll sense metal before the engine will destruct. So if he would have had that on that airplane, there's a very high probability that he'd be here talking to us today.
And don't you guys have a name for that?
It's called a Heinz filter, yeah. Jerry Beck is the one that designed that and built it.
The Commemorative Air Force is based in Texas, and the FlightLine visited the wing in South St. Paul, where you can see the P-51, other wing aircraft, and memorabilia.
The idea behind the CAF is flying aircraft. The primary focus is between 1939 and 1945 aircraft. And there's about 150 flying examples of various types of World War II airplanes, primarily U.S. airplanes.
We do that because there were people that gave us the freedom that we enjoy today. And that's why I do what I do. I think it's very important that we keep that alive. There's people that I tell my boys that there's people that you don't even know that gave their lives so that you can enjoy the freedoms you have today. And that's why we do it.